So, hello everyone. Welcome to EARIE 2020 in Bologna. This is session one with invited speakers, Jeanine Miklós-Thal from Rochester. She's an associate professor there, and Scott Kominers from Harvard Business School. He's also an associate professor. Jeanine will talk about input price discrimination by resale markets. Jeanine will have two inbuilt breaks and is happy to take questions there. Thank you very much, Jeanine. And our next speaker is Scott Kominers from HBS. He's going to talk about investment incentives in near optimal mechanisms. And Scott told me that he's happy to take questions all the time along the way in any form. So let's ask him, let's see whether he can handle that. Scott, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Very honored to be here. I've never been to Italy in live or virtually before, so this is my very first visit. And Simon, I just realized you must be up in the middle of the night, so thank you especially for chairing the session at like 1 a.m. Melbourne time. I'm very excited to be presenting about investment incentives in near optimal mechanisms. This is joint work with Mohammed Akbarpour, Shengwu Li, and Paul Milgrom. And I should say that these, as many of you may know, the three collaborators on this project are total beasts. And so, despite the fact that I'm the one sitting here presenting, I hope you'll give them the lion's share of the credit. Also, Shengwu is very kindly in the chat. So to help me make sure that we can answer questions in real time from everybody, Shengwu will also be answering questions sort of in chat as we go. So I'll answer them aloud, or he'll answer them in chat, or we both will. And so we'll attempt to get everything done. So please give the lion's share of the credit to Mohammed, Shengwu, and Paul, and also all the hard questions to Shengwu. All right, so today, today's paper, we're asking sort of a very, specific, version of a very broad and general question, which is, how does market clearing affect investment incentives? And what do I mean by that here? Well, in the world of, of market design, and especially auction market design, we think a lot about, businesses or other sort of individuals participating in an auction that's going to clear the market. It's going to determine property rights or who gets what. So a TV station might be bidding for, for channels in a wireless spectrum auction, or an airline might be bidding for landing slots. Maybe the price of those has gone down recently, but the airlines still have to claim them. And indeed, the airlines are flying back and forth, sort of empty planes just so they can keep their landing slots. But the market clearing stage, sort of we study the auction, we study the mechanism that's used to do this allocation. And that's typically sort of what we might think of as a short run or static analysis. So we assume that everyone showed up, they bring their valuations to the market, and we're going to do allocations sort of in a market clearing process. But before they show up, all of these firms are going to be making decisions that actually determine what their valuation is. There's sort of a long run that precedes this short run allocation decision. So for example, if you're bidding in a spectrum auction, you might be, needing to, before that, build, sort of invest in equipment like a studio or possibly even a tower if you're a telephone company, programming, setting up contracts. If you're bidding in a landing slot auction, you need to have built, build some following. So you have to market, you have to have bought some planes. Otherwise, the landing slot isn't going to be very, very useful. Similarly, if you need, if you're seeking time on a specialized computer system or something, you're going to invest in technology or software or something that works with it. And, the market clearing process, the way we determine who gets what, is going to affect those long run sort of ex ante investment incentives. And I'm going to tell you some stuff about that, but first let me just try and convince you that the mechanism we use matters. So let's think about the comparison between random allocation and something that's fully efficient like VCG. So if we run the VCG allocation, and let's also think that, let's simplify the problem, right? There's one, sort of there are 5 firms bidding, but one of them sort of, it's common knowledge, everyone knows this firm should win. They're the ones who really are the efficient producer. Well, so if we're doing a fully efficient allocation somehow, that fully efficient producer is of course going to, you know, invest in everything. You know, they're gonna build their towers or invest in or buy some planes or whatever the case may be. And the other firms, you know, presumably will not, right? If they it's understood that, like, you know, there's one firm that's like the, you know, the clear market leader. But of course, if we instead randomize, if we just sort of say, like, anybody can have a landing slot, just sign up. First of all, you know, those firms that otherwise might not be investing might start investing. And that firm that would have been our clear leader might, in fact, now reduce its investment because it doesn't have a, you know, a clear win. Louis Kaplow asks, the literature on takeovers had some folks addressing ex-ante incentives, such as incentives of acquirers and targets to make investments that generate synergies, broad and familiar setting. Yes, very much. Totally agreed. So, like, this is not a new class of questions. The only thing that we're going to claim is even quasi-new, and you'll see it's building on, like, you know, a bunch of prior frameworks, is the specific version of the question we ask. You know, sort of, and we'll show you that it's particularly useful in thinking about the types of allocations that we actually, like, do in a lot of these auction settings today. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that the allocation mechanism matters. Now let's talk about what our actual goal is. And again, I'll formalize all of this. This will all be much more precise very soon. But we're going to ask, you know, sort of for efficient investment, in the sense that the ex-ante investments are efficient from a social perspective. And it turns out, and we'll, you know, sort of we'll show you. So there's a theorem we obtain that really says this is a characterizing feature of VCG. In some sense, if you're incentivizing fully efficient investments, then you really are, you have to be doing something that is almost equivalent to VCG. And that's a problem because, you know, in order to implement VCG, the efficient investments, you know, sort of, or sorry, the allocation rule has to be exactly optimal. You have to actually be able to compute that fully efficient allocation in order to get fully efficient investment. And that's a real problem because in lots and lots of contexts, including these ones we just showed you, so, like, you know, sort of, you know, current spectrum auctions have all these combinatorial constraints and you know, around interference. Landing slot auctions may similarly have, you know, sort of very complicated constraints around, you know, the ways in which different sort of parts of the, you know, the landing spots and the airspace interact with travel times and so forth. From a purely computational perspective, so leaving aside whether we want to do sort of fully efficient allocation, you know, there's no equity concern, there's nothing other than just pure raw computational impossibility. We actually can't compute the exactly optimal allocation, and that means we cannot implement VCG, and that means, you know, sort of that we can't get fully efficient investments. And so we look at this natural relaxation that computer science has been looking at, you know, for years and years, which is approximately optimal allocation rules. We're going to ask, you know, suppose you can't do exact optimization, can you get close? You know, sort of, what if you get near the optimum with an approximation? And we're going to ask, you know, sort of, if we get near the approximation, do we get nearly efficient investment? Now, I wish I could just tell you, like, you know, normally you're expecting the rest of the slide to give the answer to that question, but in fact, that question is not quite well posed because there's a gap between the question of what's the allocation rule and what's the investment, because I haven't told you anything about how we actually implement that allocation rule yet. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to, you know, couple the allocation rule with a pricing rule, and we're going to set up strategy-proof implementation, and then ask, you know, sort of, does the resulting mechanism, so there's a strategy-proof, approximately optimal mechanism, does that mechanism give you incentives for approximately optimal investments? And some of you, you know, some of you may have seen, I hit the button, so I gave away the answer. That's the answer. Now you're looking at it and you're thinking, like, what the heck, Scott? Like, you know, it's, you know, middle of the, or late afternoon in Europe, or, you know, middle of the night in Australia. Like, you're showing me, like, you know, sort of a, you know, a crossbones. Well, so this is going to be your memory aid, or your mnemonic for the talk. The answer is no in general, so it's like an X for no. But yes, if X bone. We identify a condition called excluding bossy negative externalities, and I'll detail what that means. And we show that this is precisely what you need to get approximately optimal investment associated with an approximately optimal mechanism. This is going, and the good news is this is not a pathological condition. It's sort of both, reasonably, sort of reasonably general, in that you can, lots of mechanisms, or lots of rather allocation rules we use actually satisfy this property. So, it's sort of not vacuous in that, like we were showing this thing, we think of this as a possibility result rather than an impossibility result. And in particular, it covers like greedy allocation schemes and the types of schemes that we use for solving these like sort of, very combinatorially complex auctions. But it's also not, sort of, the theorem is also not meaningless in the sense that it covers everything. So there's a couple of sort of very classical approximation allocation or approximate allocation rules, including the fully polynomial time approximation for the knapsack problem, that we're going to show, or that we show, do not satisfy this condition. So we're going to characterize the condition. And indeed, I'll claim on the next slide, it's sort of nearly necessary, it's sufficient, and a straightforward relaxation becomes necessary. But this is the answer. So you get approximately optimal investment when you exclude bossy negative externalities, X-bone. Let me give an overview slide, and then I'll pause formally to take questions and see if we have any others. So what is our setup going to be? Like, we're going to imagine an allocation problem, which we can think of as, packing bidders. We'll use the metaphor of a knapsack problem, which is like, we're trying to decide which bidders are going to get access to the slot or get channels on the spectrum, band. A monotone algorithm, we'll say, guarantees a fraction, that, we'll start with a monotone algorithm that guarantees a fraction beta of the optimal value for the problem, and we'll sort of implement this in a strategy-proof way in a threshold auction. And then we're going to imagine that before the auction, so here's the way we model this pre-market investment. We're going to imagine that bidder can invest by paying a cost to raise her value. And I should say, I don't have a literature slide, but this is a a type of investment model that's been used in a bunch of previous places. Rogerson and Bergman-Valimaki sort of like introduced it for thinking about, sort of first just like investment in auctions, but then also gathering information sort of before you participate in an auction. So trying to learn more about your valuation. John Hatfield, Fukuda Kojima, and I used, the same sort of framework to study investment incentives under sort of an additive approximation model that's quite different from the one we use here, but it's a natural way to think about investment, right? It's like, you're going to build towers, you're going to like buy some planes, and the number of planes you bought determines how much you value the landing slot. If you have 0 planes, your value for the landing slot is presumably 0. If you have strictly greater than 0 planes, you have a positive value, and moreover, the investment set is probably, sort of has some like, reasonably nice geometry probably. If you buy 20,000 planes, you probably are paying more in cost than your valuation, because there aren't 20,000 landing slots, at Newark, much less at Heathrow. Three sort of, three results, or sort of three sort of like architecture, sort of sketch results. They subdivide into different pieces, but like, here's what we show. We show first, this negative result. So for any beta, there's a problem with a monotone algorithm with a beta guarantee such that there's no strictly positive investment guarantee. So in full generality, no matter how good your approximation algorithm is, for the allocation problem, investments might be arbitrarily bad. But I mentioned this X-bone condition. So for any monotone X-bone algorithm, the guarantee pushes through directly. So if you have a monotone X-bone algorithm that guarantees beta fraction of the optimum, then it also guarantees beta fraction of the optimal investment. And as I mentioned, a version of the X-bone condition is going to be sort of necessary and sufficient. And then, and I literally, like those last 2 bullet points, sort of the bullet point and point 3, I will basically just be asserting in the, in this talk, but please come chat with us or ask questions, or we can look at the paper, and discuss offline. The results are also going to extend to much more complex allocation and auction problems outside of just this like packing sort of, sort of your in, your out setting. You can do it with sort of much more complicated outcomes and sort of like a more standard general mechanism design framework. Okay, so let's pause there and check and see whether there are any questions before I go formal and like set up a model and talk about theorems and stuff.
So I have a question or two.
Please, sure.
So you're looking very much at, I mean, it seems you're looking at the problem where there's private information about your values and costs or whatever, so that you're
Yep.
using, so that there's a point using BCG. So how about the investment improving the distribution from which you're going to draw your values?
Great.
Do your results extend to that?
So we haven't worked it out. So the question is, and we'll see in a second, like we're imagining, a structure of private information around the values, relative to the designer. So the designer doesn't know people's values. And the question is, what happens if there's also sort of uncertainty in the values themselves, right? So the bidder is, instead of investing in getting a very specific value, they're investing in something that will, give them a distribution. So if you're buying airplanes to build out, so your airline business with your landing slots, you don't necessarily anticipate that there's a pandemic that might reduce the value of having airplanes and landing slots and so forth. Sorry for the example, but it's very much on my mind, and probably on everybody else's. So we haven't worked it out. My conjecture would be yes, and sort of two reasons for that intuition. Sort of there would be some subtlety in like formulating what the investment object is. It would be like a distribution over distributions, and so there might be some measure type concerns around exactly what the investment problem looks like, and like when sort of like when some of the inequalities in the arguments are sort of like well defined or true almost everywhere. There might be some like measure theoretic things going on, but I think sort of conceptually everything we're saying it should carry over, and that's definitely what John Fujito and I found in an additive framework. So it's there we were able to do all of the same types of arguments with these distributions over distributions, but we had to like sort of make some assumptions about how convex those distributions were and things like that. You said you might have a couple of questions. Was there a follow-up?
Well, the other one was, you're looking at the near optimality in a computer science kind of
yes.
sense, right? But you could also think about it in an economic sense, right? Rather than allocating efficiently, I want to maximize the weighted value of social surplus or revenue or something like that in the mechanism. But that seems very far afield from what you're doing.
That's a great point. So actually, so when we do those other types of maximizations, we don't often get the types of of outcome guarantees that we get in computer science. So you don't necessarily have one of these multiplicative approximations. But I believe there are some theorems of that form that like if you maximize social welfare, then you're like still within a factor of 2 or 1/2, depending on which way you coordinatize, of the sort of fully optimal efficient allocation or something. So like if there were like a bounded distortion created by that type of maximization, then that might also fall into this framework as well. It's a great point, actually. Had not thought about it at all. Shengwu, feel free to chime in that too. You might have a better prior than I do. Lewis asks, does Xbone rule out that bidders are competitors? Or best answered later. The answer is it does not rule out that bidders are competitors. In fact, it's ruling out exclusively negative externalities caused by the approximation in the algorithm. So the funny thing, and I'll show you an example of this, assuming we have time, is that approximation means that when I change my investment, I can sort of like move in the approximation space of the algorithm in a way that can harm other bidders, without sort of changing my allocation. That's why we're thinking of sort of like bossiness. It's like a bossy externality. It's sort of it affects welfare, but it doesn't really affect me very much. Not because I sort of outcompeted somebody, but rather just I caused the algorithm to sort of like jump over a discontinuity or something like that. And so we're very much going to be allowing the types of externalities you expect in auction design. We're only trying to rule out externalities that just operate through the algorithm. And in fact, only negative ones. Shangwu says, wish I could chime in, but I don't think there is a way for participants to do that easily. Oh, you should be able to post in the general chat. I think. I'm not totally sure. All right, so let's go on and set up a model. So So this is gonna be a little bit funny. So I'm gonna set up a model that's gonna look very familiar sort of until we get to the investment stage. But so here's our sort of like classical, sort of auction and allocation framework. We have a set N of bidders. Oh, and there's one sense in which it doesn't quite look classical, which is that because we're doing worst case analysis, we're actually going to be doing evaluation sort of at the level of these instance objects. So, an instance is going to be a valuation and set of feasible allocations pair, and we're going to sort of be doing our analysis over like the set of, sets of instances, sort of allocation problems. And an algorithm is just going to sort of determine an allocation. So it's basically going to give us for any individual instance, it's going to give us sort of a set of bidders here in this case who we're going to think of as those who are packed or assigned the good or something of the sort. And the rule is going to be that your algorithm has to be feasible in the sense that, given everyone's, given the set of, feasible allocations, the allocation rule, the allocation algorithm picks a feasible allocation. Footnote, there's a convexity assumption. Let me pause. I guess I'll pause at the end of each model slide to ask if anybody has questions about the setup. Pause here. Oh, and Shengwu says the chat is locked, unfortunately. Okay, so if Shengwu, if you want to send smoke signals, send them through the question answer, and I'll try and comment. All right. So quick example, just to make sure, because it's a little bit of an unusual way to set up. The knapsack problem has, as its set an instance, is really like, a set of feasible allocations, right? It's essentially sort of valuations for the, valuations for the agents for being packed or not, and sort of this set of, feasible agents we can take at once. If there's this idea that like you're packing people into a knapsack, they have different sizes, it might only be feasible to pack the one large one, or you could pack many small ones or something of the sort. And so we're going to like be optimizing, we're going to be sort of like studying the properties of algorithms and allocation, sort of like, our allocation framework over sort of, we're going to try and prove results that sort of hold across these instances. Like what's the worst case across all of them? Welfare. So the welfare of an algorithm at a given instance, easy enough. It's just going to be the sum for all the agents who are packed, who are assigned, the good, of their value for being packed / assigned. An optimal welfare is going to be the welfare created by the optimal algorithm. So the algorithm that like sort of chooses the maximum, the maximizing allocation. Now, of course, we aren't necessarily going to be able to compute the optimum, but that's sort of going to be our benchmark. We're going to like frequently compare to that optimum and thinking about how well we're doing. Is that okay? This should be very standard, I think, this particular slide. Going once, going twice. All right, sold. So now that was our allocation problem. So that's just the question of like, how do we determine, who's packed and who's not? On top of that, we're going to wrap this reporting problem. So this is where our mechanisms appear. So the mechanism is a combination of an algorithm, and a payment rule. And we're going to say that an algorithm is monotone. I'm going to move the pictures, images a little bit so I can gesture on this properly. So an algorithm is going to be monotone, on a for a given problem, if for every instance associated with that problem and every agent or every bidder, if that bidder is packed, and I raise that bidder's value, holding everything else fixed, then that bidder will still be packed. Right, so this is like a very, very natural and standard concept of monotonicity. Basically says if I'm going to raise your value holding everything else fixed, I'm not going to like sort of suddenly cause you to not get the object or not be packed. So this is like I've raised suddenly you're twice as popular an airline. As a result, you'd better be more likely to get a landing slot weekly. And note, this is very intuitive. You can also start to see how this is going to start relating to our choices of investment somehow, right? Like if you're in the business of choosing your valuation, we're going to want to understand how that interacts with the allocation rule. And if your allocation rule is sort of like very non-monotone, then there are all sorts of reasons you might make very strange investment choices. And it turns out that for any monotone allocation rule, monotone algorithm, the threshold auction is going to be strategy proof. So there's sort of like a simple way of implementing any monotone algorithm, which is we're just going to sort of charge people, charge bidders their cutoff prices. Sort of what's the cutoff at which, in the event that you end up being packed, what's the cutoff that's sort of just on the margin of whether you would or would not have been packed. And of course, this is very intuitive. This is like a second price auction or a VCG like auction, but it turns out it's a much more general implementation result. If I take any monotone algorithm, I can sort of convert it into a threshold auction in this way. So for the optimal algorithm, let me finish this slide and then I'll pause again. So for the optimal algorithm, so the algorithm that's going to pick the optimal allocation, the corresponding threshold auction, no surprise here, is going to be exactly VCG. More broadly, so first, as I already mentioned, if you take a monotone algorithm and sort of equip it with this threshold pricing rule, you get a strategy proof mechanism. But there's actually a converse, which is essentially that those are all of the strategy proof mechanisms. So if I give you a strategy proof strategy proof mechanism, then I can sort of invert it. With a monotone allocation rule, then I can invert it into a threshold auction. Plus the sort of threshold price plus some other sort of VCG additive term. Remember, you can always add on a term that doesn't depend on the stated value of the bidder. So I can tax them a bunch for showing up, but not dependent on their valuation. And so this set of threshold the set of threshold rules is sort of exhaustive. And so we're gonna be focusing on this threshold implementation. And again, sort of we'll be taking monotone algorithms, turning them into monotone threshold auctions, and asking what that does to investment. Next pause right here. Any questions or queries? Going once. Going twice. All right. So last piece of the basic architecture. Sorry, I know this is much longer for a model section than anybody ever wants to see, but we're almost done, I promise. So we're gonna imagine that some bidder, we'll call him Iota for now. I'm not sure I like that idea, but we'll take recommendations for alternate bidder names, is gonna choose an investment from a finite set. So you're gonna choose some valuation at some cost. You're choosing the previous thing was the standard mechanism design framework. Now we're imagining that you're choosing your value in the original allocation problem at some cost. Then you're going to face one of these threshold auctions. And your goal, as Iota, is to maximize your payoff, sort of knowing what everybody else is doing. So Iota is now sort of a single investing bidder. We have some stuff to say in the paper about multiple investing bidders, but for the purposes of the talk, let's focus on a single investing bidder. And ask, sort of how is this bidder going to invest given sort of the threshold auction rule? And we say that the mechanism has efficient investments if for every sort of investment, set of options I can give you, a set of, valuations for the other bidders and sort of set of feasible allocations, the individually optimal investment set corresponds to the the socially optimal investments. And so this is our baseline, sort of efficient investments goal. We would like to have the mechanism guarantee fully efficient investments, and note these argmax is there because these things can be multi-valued. But what is this really saying? It's saying, we're asking that the bidder's optimal investment choices line up with the social planner's investment choices for that bidder. Quick footnote, we've normalized the cheapest investment to cost 0. We will possibly not mention that again in this talk because I'm not sure we're gonna have time to do the proof, but there's a normalization. But this is the condition. So we're going for fully efficient investments for now. I haven't said anything about approximation yet as a side note. We're getting there. But anybody sort of sort of like puzzled or stuck now? Like, does this all make sense so far? Awesome. Okay, so baseline proposition, sort of one direction, sort of any VCG auction has efficient investments. And this is a like sort of classical canonical fact. Like this is just sort of like a property of VCG, known at least since Rogerson. But there's effectively a converse, which is that VCG is essentially the only such mechanism. And formally, what do we mean? So if we have an algorithm that has constrained efficient allocation, so it's efficient on some subset, and with an associated strategy proof, sort of mechanism, then that mechanism has efficient investments. And similarly, I can swap, sort of efficient investments and strategy proof diffs. If I give you a constrained efficient allocation algorithm that has, associated with an efficient mechanism that induces efficient investments, then we get strategy proofness. So these two are sort of, almost like a duality between strategy proofness and efficient investments. And this builds on a classical idea that like sort of, it's behind the results of Rogerson and Bergman and Valimaki and also Alvarez-Omana on Count de Leon. And then it's sort of John and Fujito and I have one version of it, and we have another one of it, sort of Mohammed and Shengwu and I have a version of it here. But new and sort of very specific to this type of setting is this sort of third direction or third sort of pair, which is that if a mechanism is strategy proof and has efficient investments, then sort of it's almost everywhere constrained efficient. It sort of behaves like VCG, almost everywhere. And so there's a real sense in which VCG is the only way to get efficient investments in this framework. I mentioned that
sorry,
we're not, yeah, go for it.
Sorry to interrupt, but just I missed that. What is constraint efficient?
So on a subset of so basically you don't quite get full efficiency. You get it's going to be efficient on a subset of the allocation, or sort of on the subset of the feasible set. So like basically it looks like VCG on some projection. Trying to think if there's a better. You basically trying to think if there's a way to sketch it. Shengwu, I'm not going to be able to sketch it off the top of my head in enough time. Shengwu, if there's like a 2-sentence like thing, there's a 2-sentence summary you can think of. If you throw it in the Q&A, we may even have it. There we go. Oh, I was going to ask for a subset of the argument. Right. There exists a subset of the feasible allocation such that the algorithm always picks the best allocation of the subset. But what I was going to ask is if you can think of a quick way to sketch why the argument for this third direction picks out this subset of the feasible allocations. Because that's sort of like the part of it that is like still miraculous to me, and I don't really have a good like intuitive grasp of like how to explain it quickly. That would be awesome. But yeah, so the formal condition is subset of, Shengwu writes, it's miraculous to me too. Okay. the argument picks out a subset of feasible allocations, and so it sort of implicitly like generates this projection. And I guess I'm not the only one who thinks it's a miracle. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better intuition for why that's true, but so far it's still miraculous. This is actually the most recent thing we've proven, and so we're still grokking it. Okay, so sorry, caveat, coordination problems with multiple investors, but bigger caveat, as I mentioned earlier, we can't always actually compute the VCG allocation. So let me pause quickly and say, okay, so we're sort of like, at this funny impasse, right? On the one hand, like that's like pretty cool. We've like exactly characterized when we can get efficient investments. Unfortunately, it's VCG, which is, not computable in general. And this is what motivates this sort of push to approximately optimal mechanisms. So now very quickly, let me give you our notion of approximation, and then I'll sort of state the negative result and state the positive result, and probably won't have time to prove it. So an algorithm is going to be a beta approximation for allocation. If, sort of for every instance, the algorithm, the welfare under the algorithm is sort of within a factor of beta of the optimal under that. So it's like a worst case concept of, of allocative allocative optimization. That's why we're sort of optimizing over all the instances. We can do a similar thing with investment. So before I could just say like these things are equal, but now I actually have to like, write it as an inequality. We're saying an algorithm is a beta approximation for investment. If the chosen investment by the agent is within sort of a beta factor of the socially optimal investment. So I just relaxed both of my, sort of conditions. So I went from efficiency to approximate efficiency, and I went from investment efficiency to approximate investment efficiency. Sort of quick like example to hold in your head, we can think about a knapsack where like all the agents have sort of sizes, and that determines the feasible subsets. The optimum algorithm is just going to pick an optimal solution, of course. So of all the feasible subsets, which is the allocation that maximizes the sum of values. The greedy algorithm says, let's be as greedy as we can. We'll sort of pick the highest marginal value bidders and pack them in that order and just stop when I reach one that I can't fit. And there's an algorithm called mgreedy, which selects the optimum between greedy and the most valuable individually feasible bidder. And you might be asking, like, why do we care about that? That's the last thing on this slide. So greedy, it turns out, actually does not have a very good, like, sort of worst case guarantee. So the across all possible problems, greedy can have sort of like arbitrarily bad welfare relative to the optimum. But that's because it sort of sometimes misses like, sort of a very, very like, valuable but hard to pack bidder. And so it turns out that mgreedy, actually has a guarantee of a half. So that's our first example of an approximately, optimal allocation rule. And it turns out that mgreedy is also going to be approximately optimal for investment, and I'll state that as a consequence of our main result. But first, you should, the natural question to wonder is, do the guarantees always push through like this, right? Like that would be the hope, and in fact, that's sort of where we started hoping. But unfortunately, the answer is no. So let's see. How am I in time? I think the session's supposed to end at 12 and we started 5 minutes late, so it's maybe till 12:05. Is that right?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, am I wrong? Am I just making it up? Okay. My plan is to talk for 5 more minutes and then allow some Q&A or something. Okay, so a knapsack of capacity. Oh, sorry, but I said that in a weird time zone. 12 my time. Okay, a knapsack of capacity 2, 2 bidders of size 1. It's always going to be optimal to pack both. But here's an approximately optimal algorithm. I can just sort of pack sort of only I if I is sort of like dominant, right? If I alone gets me enough of the total value, then I'll just pack I. Now in the associated threshold auction, the optimum is to pack both. The pricing is such that I's price should always be 0 because I is always going to get packed. But now, like, what if we give I an investment that looks sort of like this? So I has, value 0 for cost 0, or value k plus epsilon for cost k. The social optimum says I should invest, right? We're going to pack both. J gives us 1, I gives us k plus epsilon, but we pay k, so we get 1 plus epsilon in welfare, which is way better than if we just got 1 and I didn't invest. But if I make k large enough, I is like the majority share of all the value in society, and so the algorithm is only going to pack I, and we get welfare epsilon. Whoops. So the performance of this algorithm is actually epsilon over 1 plus epsilon, which of course goes to 0 as I make epsilon small. So what broke? What broke was that sort of when I chose to invest, it sort of invested, and if I's investing enough, right? If this k is sort of like large enough, it's jumping in the allocation. There's this funny externality whereby, after I invest, only I becomes packed. And so raising the packed bidder's value actually got us to a worse approximation of the optimum because of sort of a discontinuity, if you will, in the algorithm. So I is packed when with no value, raising, V doesn't affect whether I is packed and doesn't affect I's price. It's a threshold auction, but it does lower the total value for the other bidders. And so I isn't accounting for this algorithmic externality when choosing investments, and that's exactly the problem. So this is our negative externality. It's like I is sort of like bossily affecting the other agents, sort of through his investment choice, mapping, and the externality acts through the allocation determined by the algorithm. So the negative result is, that example just sort of embeds or generalizes to tell us that for any approximation guarantee I choose, I can find you a problem in a monotone algorithm that doesn't have a strictly positive investment guarantee. So unfortunately, near optimal allocation does not always imply near optimal investments. Last thing we're going to do, there's this condition. As I mentioned, we can rule out these types of bossy negative externalities. So what are we doing? Here's the formalism of it, but really what we're guaranteeing is that if the value of a packed bidder is increased or the value of an unpacked bidder is reduced, the total value generated for other bidders does not fall. So through my investment choice, if I don't change my own allocation, I also don't sort of have negative externalities on the other bidders. Lots of algorithms that are familiar, have this property. In particular, this M-greedy I described, does. Also, the join of the maximum of a bunch of exponent algorithms is also exponent, which is another way in which we sort of move away from bossiness. And sort of the positive result is going to be that if I give you a monotone and exponent algorithm that's a beta approximation for allocation, then it's also going to be a beta approximation for investment. And so first thing we can derive from that in the previous couple slides, that M-greedy is going to be a 1/2 approximation for investment. So that's what I promised. We do get this push through of the beta equals 1/2 for M-greedy. But more generally, there's a version of this statement that's true for much more complex allocation problems. We also have a version for combinatorial auctions under sort of appropriate sort of structure conditions on the costs. And then also exponent is almost necessary in the sense that there's a sort of straightforward and not very, not very relaxation of it that's going to be necessary and sufficient. So I think we should pause there. I have a couple slides on the proof that maybe I should just flash so that if people are watching the video later, they want to see them, they want to look at them, they can. So let me flash proof slide 1. Flash proof slide 2. And then we'll just close with the results. So we've asked about how do these approximate allocation algorithms affect a bidder's investment incentives. I mentioned that there's this like intermediate step where we have to actually like go from the allocation mechanism, the allocation algorithm to an allocation mechanism. You implement a monotone, approximately optimal allocation algorithm, and if it is exponent and sort of nearly if and only if it's not quite if and only if, but if it is exponent and sort of morally if and only if it is exponent, then you get the approximation guarantee to push through to investment. So when can you get efficient investments from an approximately efficient investments from an approximately efficient allocation rule? Answer: exponent.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you.
That was a great presentation, and it was one of the first times I really enjoyed seeing proofs in a talk, right? You can further down the track, you can watch them in slow-mo.
I love it. Yeah, I've never thought about that. It's a real feature that we can now speed up or slow down the proof presentation through our slide demo.
That's great. I don't see any other questions. Maybe give people a minute or so to ask. I just thought that the positive result is actually really neat and provides a guidance as to how should you select among these practical algorithms. So that's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we're super excited, and again, it's a good news theorem in that like a lot of these, a lot of the algorithms we're actually using to do allocation in threshold auctions right now happen to satisfy this property. So, it's good. We were incentivizing efficient investment and didn't even know it.
Near efficient.
Near efficient. Yes. Sorry. we were getting close to incentivizing efficient investment and didn't know it, but I'm sure all of the bidders did. All right, questions going once, going twice. All right, sold. All right. Well, I guess we're packed.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks again to Jeanine and Scott for a very entertaining and excellent session.
Thanks again for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you soon.
QD.
Bye.
Bye.